On my wedding night, my mother-in-law threw a bucket of dirty underwear belonging to all the men in the family at me and said, "You're the wife now. It's your job to wash it." I refused, and my husband hit me in front of her. I didn't scream. I grabbed my suitcase and called my lawyer, without telling them who I really was. The water hit the carpet before I understood what was happening. Then it hit my feet. Cold, gray, smelling of cheap detergent, and something underneath that, sweat maybe, or just old fabric that hadn't been washed in a while. I looked down, men's underwear, 4 hours into my marriage, and I was staring at a floating pile of men's underwear in dirty water that had just been dumped at my feet by my mother-in-law. I was still in my dress. The lace at the hem was already soaking it up, turning translucent where the water touched it. My hair was still pinned the way the stylist had done it that morning. Small white flowers tucked behind my ear, the kind Jonathan said made me look like I belonged in a painting. "Wash it by hand," Florence said. She was standing in the doorway of what was supposed to be our bedroom, arms crossed, chin lifted like she was daring me to say something. "We don't waste electricity on nonsense in this house." I didn't move. I was doing the math without meaning to, the way I do when something doesn't add up. 4 hours married, 1 bucket of dirty underwear, 0 explanation. "I married Jonathan today," I said. "I wasn't hired as your maid." Her face did something I hadn't seen it do before. It twisted, fast, like a switch had been flipped. And then she was screaming. Not words at first, just noise, high and sharp, the kind that's designed to bring people running. It worked. Jonathan came through the door, still in his tuxedo jacket, tie loosened, and I watched his eyes go from his mother to the bucket to me. I watched him decide, in under 2 seconds, who the problem was. It wasn't the bucket. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the 2 years before it. I met Jonathan at a fundraising gala I wasn't even supposed to enjoy, one I'd only agreed to attend because Thomas had begged off with a family emergency. I was there representing my firm, technically, though nobody in that ballroom knew what my firm actually meant when I said it, because I never said it. I told people I worked in finance, back office stuff, nothing exciting. I told them I was a secretary, sometimes an executive assistant, if I wanted to sound slightly more competent. I ran Vanguard Capital. I'd built it from a 14-person shop into a firm managing just under $9 billion in assets. My name was on the 10th floor. My signature had closed deals bigger than anything most of the men in that ballroom had ever touched. And I told all of them I typed memos for a living because I had learned the expensive way, twice. What happens when men find out what you're worth before they find out who you are? Jonathan didn't know any of that. He asked me if I wanted to get out of the noise for a few minutes, and we ended up on a balcony talking about nothing for 45 minutes, and he made me laugh twice, genuinely, which at that point in my life was a higher bar than most people understood. For 2 years, I was Charlotte Davis to him, an orphan. True, that part was real. My parents died when I was in my 20s. A secretary. Not true, but close enough to the version of myself I let people see. A woman who rented a studio apartment in a mediocre part of town, because that's what a secretary could afford, and I wanted to know something. I wanted to know if a man could love a version of me with nothing behind it. No firm, no signature, no 10th floor. I want to say I had good reasons for that test. I did, at the time. I'm less sure now that testing someone for 2 years is the same thing as trusting them. There were things I noticed and let go. That's the part I keep circling back to. The first thing was small. 6 months in, Jonathan mentioned his mother had picked out the venue for his sister's wedding without asking his sister, had already put down a deposit before his sister even knew there was a venue to discuss. I laughed because it sounded like an overbearing mom story, the kind everyone has, the kind that makes for good small talk at a second date. He didn't laugh. "That's just how it goes in my family," he said, flat, like he was reciting a rule rather than telling a joke. "And your sister was fine with that? She didn't have much choice." He said it without any edge to it, like the absence of choice was simply a fact of weather, not something anyone needed to feel strongly about. I told myself it was a strange thing to say and left it there. I didn't ask a follow-up question, which is not something I would ever do at work. At work, a flat non-answer like that is exactly the kind of thing that makes me ask 3 more questions before I sign anything. I filed it under interesting family dynamic and moved on because I was 28 years old and enjoying being courted by a smart, funny man, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who audited her boyfriend's family stories for red flags. The second thing happened at his parents' house for Thanksgiving, a year in. Florence served every man at the table before any of the women, including herself, including her own daughter, moved around the table with the serving dish in a specific practiced order that told me this wasn't the first time she'd done it that way. Richard didn't seem to notice. Jonathan didn't seem to notice. His sister Kaylee caught my eye across the table for half a second and then looked back down at her plate, and something about the speed of that look, the way she'd clearly trained herself not to linger on it, told me more than anything anyone said out loud that day. When I offered to help clear plates after dinner, Florence waved me back into my chair. "No, sit. You're a guest," she said. And there was something in the way she said guest, a small, deliberate weight on the word, like she was drawing a line and letting me know politely that I should stay behind it. I told myself it was old-fashioned hospitality. I'd grown up around Midwestern relatives who did the same thing without meaning anything cruel by it. Aunts who'd fight you for the dish towel out of pure manners. I told Denise about it 2 days later, half as a joke, and she said, "That's not hospitality, that's a hierarchy." And I laughed can change the subject, because I didn't want to think about hierarchies. I wanted to think about how good the pie had been. The third thing was the prenup conversation that never happened. I brought it up once, gently, over dinner, framing it as something my fictional financial advisor had recommended for anyone getting married, a box to check rather than a referendum on trust. It was, if I'm honest, the closest I let myself get to testing the waters about my real situation without actually revealing it. Jonathan went quiet, set his fork down. My family doesn't do business contracts inside a marriage, he said, like I'd suggested something faintly obscene, something that belonged in a different kind of relationship than the one we were building. It's not really about business, it's just, Charlotte, I make more in a year than you'll see in 5. If anything, I should be the one worried, and I'm telling you I'm not. Doesn't that mean something? I let it drop. I remember feeling almost grateful in the moment, like he'd said something generous. In hindsight, I let a lot of things drop that night that a person in my actual profession would never let drop from a counterparty, starting with the fact that he'd answered a question about mutual protection with a statement about his own income, as though the only asymmetry either of us needed to worry about ran in his favor. The fourth thing was my friend Denise, the only person who knew who I really was, the only person I hadn't performed Charlotte Davis for since the night I met her in business school, a decade before any of this. She met Jonathan twice. After the second dinner, she waited until he'd gone to settle the bill and said quietly, "He talks to you like he's already decided something about you. What does that mean?" "I don't know exactly. It's in how he finishes your sentences. Like he's not listening for what you're going to say. He's just waiting for you to catch up to what he already thinks." I told her she was reading into it, that he was just confident, that confident men sometimes talk that way, and it doesn't mean anything darker than confidence. "Maybe," she said, "but watch how he is with his mother in the room versus without her. I only saw it for about 10 minutes tonight, right when she called to ask what time you were both coming to Sunday dinner. He got smaller. You didn't notice?" I hadn't. I went back and thought about it afterward and realized she was right. His voice had changed on that call, gone thin and quick, agreeing to things before his mother had finished asking. I watched for it after that, at the next few family gatherings, and Denise wasn't wrong. I filed the observation under nerves before the wedding instead of what it probably was, which was a preview. The fifth thing happened 3 weeks before the ceremony. Jonathan and I were choosing appliances for the house his parents were letting us use. His childhood home, technically, with Lawrence and his father, Richard, still living there. An arrangement I should have asked more questions about. I picked out a washing machine. A good one, mid-range, nothing extravagant. Florence saw the receipt on the counter 2 days later and said, in front of Jonathan, "Why would we need that? I've never used one in 30 years of marriage." Jonathan didn't say anything. He just looked uncomfortable and changed the subject. I should have understood what that silence meant. I didn't. I told myself he was avoiding conflict with his mother, which is a normal, forgivable thing, and I married him 3 weeks later believing that. So there I was, 4 hours married, standing in dirty water in my wedding dress, watching my new husband decide his mother was right and I was the problem. "Just do what my mother says," Jonathan said. "Don't start trouble tonight. You want me to hand wash your father's underwear? Tonight? My mother did it her whole life. Now it's your turn. If it matters so much, wash it yourself." Florence gasped like I'd said something obscene. She grabbed his arm. "Listen to how she talks to you," she hissed. "Put her in her place. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision matters, and because I've had to say this part out loud more times than I ever wanted to." Jonathan had been drinking since the reception. Champagne, then something stronger once his father started pouring. His eyes were red-rimmed, unfocused in the way that made his movements slightly too big for the room. He grabbed my arm, hard enough that my heel slipped on the wet carpet. "Don't talk back to my mother. Let go of me." He didn't let go. He got his face close to mine, close enough that I could smell the alcohol, and he screamed at me. No words I could pick out individually, just volume, just the raw fact of a man 3 inches taller than me using his voice as a weapon. My ears rang after. I didn't cry. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters. I didn't cry, and I didn't scream back. I stood there and understood, in the space of maybe 4 seconds, that I had spent 2 years getting to know a man who did not exist. The man in front of me now, red-eyed, gripping my arm, screaming 3 inches from my face, this was who Jonathan actually was. I had just never seen it before because I had never given him a reason to show me. Then his hand came up and he struck me across the face. Florence smiled. "Finally," she said. "Someone taught her some respect." I didn't touch my cheek. I didn't check if it was bleeding. I bent down, picked up the bucket with both hands, and poured every drop of that gray water over Jonathan's head. He stood there soaked, blinking, his tuxedo ruined, his mother shrieking behind him. "That was the last time you ever touched me," I said. I packed one bag, the go bag I kept in the closet without ever telling him why, an old habit from a childhood I don't discuss, and walked to the door. He chased me, sobering fast, the way people do when consequences start to feel real. "You'll be crawling back in a week," he shouted. "You have nothing without my money." I got in the car. I rolled down the window because I wanted him to hear this part clearly. "You'll have divorce papers by morning. What lawyer can you even afford?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The car pulled away, and somewhere behind me, Florence was still screaming something I didn't bother listening to. I called my actual lawyer from the car. Not a number Jonathan had ever seen in my phone. I kept 2 phones, which sounds paranoid until you've run a 9-figure firm and understood exactly how many people want something from you the moment they know what you're worth. Her name was Priya Priya Nair, a partner at Halloran and Voss with 22 years in matrimonial and asset law, and she'd handled 2 prior situations for friends of mine, quietly, the way people in my world handle things. He hit me, I told her, in front of his mother. I have the marks starting already. Are you safe right now? I'm in my car. I'm safe. Then the first thing we do is document everything, tonight, while it's fresh. Photos of the injury, a time-stamped note of what happened, and I want you at an urgent care or ER within the hour, so there's a medical record independent of anything either of us writes down. I did exactly that. I drove myself to an urgent care clinic 40 minutes from the house, deliberately not the one closest to Jonathan's parents, because I didn't want a receptionist who might recognize the family or a nurse who'd been at the wedding 2 days earlier passing out programs. The waiting room was nearly empty at that hour. A vending machine hummed. Somewhere behind the front desk, a television played the local news with the sound off. I filled out an intake form in handwriting steadier than I expected, and under reason for visit, I wrote assault, documentation requested, because Priya had told me on the phone, plainly, not to soften the language for anyone's comfort, including my own. A physician named Dr. Aaron Kessler saw me a little after midnight. A soft-spoken man, unhurried in a way that felt deliberate rather than slow, the kind of unhurried that comes from having done an exam like this enough times to know that rushing it helps no one. He photographed the bruising forming along my jaw from multiple angles, and the finger-shaped marks already darkening on my upper arm where Jonathan had gripped me hard enough to make my heel slip. He measured them with a small plastic ruler laid against my skin. The way I'd later learn was standard for establishing scale in the photographs. I'm documenting this in your chart with a timestamp, he said. Right now, it's 11:52 p.m., which I'll note is important. It establishes how soon after the incident you sought care, which matters if this ever needs to hold up somewhere official. It will, I said. I already know that. He didn't ask me to explain what I meant by that. He just nodded and kept writing. I'd recommend a follow-up in 48 hours to photograph how the bruising develops further, he added. Bruises document better once they've fully colored. Day 1 and day 3, side by side, tends to tell a more complete story than either alone. I nodded. I was aware, in a distant clinical way, that I was being an excellent witness for myself. I'd spent a career reading other people's documentation, deciding what counted and what was noise. I knew exactly what mattered here, and I made sure Dr. Kessler's chart had all of it before I let myself leave that clinic. And finally, 4 hours after my wedding had started, cry in a parking lot alone in my car. The next morning, I came back to the house, not alone. Priya came with me, along with a court reporter named Denise Alvarez, no relation to my friend Denise, a coincidence that struck me as almost funny given the night I'd had, to create a certified record of anything said on the premises. I also brought 4 movers from a company I'd used for office relocations before, because everything in that house had been purchased with my money, under my name, and I had the receipts to prove every last item of it. Florence answered the door in her bathrobe, and the moment she registered who was behind me, she started screaming about thieves before anyone had said a word, before the movers had even stepped out of the truck, before Priya had opened her mouth. "You're not taking anything out of this house," Florence said, blocking the doorway with her body like that would do something against 4 professional movers and a court reporter. "Everything in this house that we're removing was purchased with my funds, under my name," I said. "You're welcome to review the documentation." Priya set a black binder on the entryway table, unhurried. The way you set something down when you know it's going to end the conversation, regardless of how loudly the other person keeps talking. Receipts, bank transfer records, appliance serial numbers matched against purchase confirmations, page after page. 22 months of documentation, because I had never, not once during our relationship, stopped being the person who keeps records. A habit I'd assumed was just professional caution, and that turned out, in the end, to be the only reason I walked out of that house with anything. "Call the police if you'd like," Priya said, calm, like she was discussing weather. "We're happy to wait for them." Jonathan came down the stairs in yesterday's clothes, hung over, and started flipping through the binder. I watched his face lose color page by page. "Where did you get this kind of money?" Florence sniffed, arms crossed. "Some rich old man must be paying for it." I didn't answer either of them. I walked past both of them toward the door, and something made me stop. "Don't you have a meeting this morning?" I asked. "The big one, for your funding." Jonathan's face changed, lit up almost, in a way that made my stomach turn, because I understood immediately what he thought was happening. He thought his real life, his important life, was about to resume, and this, the bucket, the bruise, the binder, was just an ugly detour he'd get to leave behind by walking into a boardroom. "I do," he said, "and once I close that deal, you're going to regret every second of this. Then you'd better not be late." I need to explain what Jonathan's company actually was, because it matters for what happened that afternoon. He ran a mid-stage logistics software startup called Fenwick Route, a decent product from what I understood, route optimization for regional freight companies, the kind of business that's genuinely useful and genuinely hard to scale without serious capital. He'd been chasing a Series C for 8 months. $120 million, structured as a lead investment from one fund, with 2 smaller funds following. The lead fund was Vanguard Capital. I hadn't engineered this. I want to be honest about that, because it would make a better story if I'd orchestrated the whole thing, planted myself in his path specifically to destroy him later. I hadn't. Vanguard's growth equity team had been evaluating Fenwick Route for months before I ever met Jonathan at that gala, run by a managing director named Thomas Reyes who had 19 years in venture and growth investing and who reported deal specifics to me the same way he reported every deal above 50 million, because that was my firm and that was my threshold for personal sign-off. I had recused myself from active involvement in the Fenwick deal the moment I realized 3 months into dating Jonathan that the CEO across the table from Thomas Reyes was the man I was seeing. I'd told Thomas there was a personal conflict without details and let the growth team run the process independently. I'd been staying out of it entirely until that morning. That afternoon, I stood behind the one-way glass on the top floor of my own headquarters, a viewing room used for observing pitch rehearsals and due diligence sessions, windowless on Jonathan's side, fully visible on mine. Thomas had texted me twice that morning, before either of us knew what had happened the night before, confirming the meeting time, still treating it as an ordinary Tuesday closing. I hadn't told him anything yet. I wanted to see the meeting happen the way it was supposed to happen, on its own terms, before I decided whether to change anything about it. Jonathan walked into the boardroom in his best suit, carrying a folder of slides he believed would save his company. He shook hands with Thomas Reyes, who I could see through the glass, giving no indication that anything unusual was happening. He shook hands with our general counsel, a woman named Elena Marsh, 11 years specializing in growth stage financing agreements, who was there to walk him through final terms if the vote went his way. He didn't shake hands with anyone else in the room because he didn't know there was anyone else to shake hands with. He had no idea whose signature was actually required to release $120 million, and no idea that the signature in question belonged to a woman whose bruised jaw was currently covered carefully by a layer of concealer she'd never needed to wear to a board meeting before. He sat down across from Thomas, smiled the smile I used to think was warm, and opened his folder. He talked through his first slide, customer acquisition cost, trending down for the third straight quarter, with the easy confidence of a man who had rehearsed this pitch in front of a mirror. The door behind the mirror was still closed. He still didn't know I was watching. I'm not going to pretend the next hour was some dramatic unveiling with lightning and thunder. It wasn't. It was quiet, almost administrative, which somehow made it worse for him. Thomas Reyes ran the meeting exactly as planned. Jonathan walked through his growth projections, his customer retention numbers, his burn rate, all of it competent, all of it the pitch of a man who genuinely believed he was 2 hours from being saved. Partway through, Elena Marsh excused herself, stepped into the hallway, and knocked on the observation room door. He's asking good questions about the term sheet, she said. He still thinks this closes today. He should, I said. As far as the room knows, it still might. That's the truth, actually. It's not up to me alone. But it's not nothing that you're standing back here. No, I said. It's not nothing. That was true, and I want to be clear about it, because I think the version of this story where I single-handedly torched his company out of spite is more satisfying and less honest. The Series C wasn't mine to unilaterally kill. Vanguard had a 4-person investment committee for deals this size, and the vote required a majority. What I could do, what I did do, 20 minutes later, was walk into that boardroom myself. Jonathan turned around when the door opened. I watched 2 years of a relationship rearrange itself behind his eyes in real time. Charlotte? Actually, I said, it's Elizabeth. Elizabeth Whitfield. I'm the managing partner here. The silence in that room lasted long enough that I counted it. 4 full seconds. The same amount of time it had taken him, the night before, to decide his mother was right about me. You run, he stopped. Started again. This is your firm. It's my firm. Thomas Reyes, to his credit, kept his expression entirely professional, though I knew him well enough to see the flicker of, oh, so this is what she meant by a personal conflict. I recused myself from this deal 3 months ago, I told the room, mostly for Elena's record keeping, when I realized the CEO of Fenwick Route was someone I was personally involved with. I'm not here to influence the committee's vote. The investment committee will decide this on the merits, same as any other deal at this stage. I'm here because I think Mr. Miller should hear the reason for my recusal directly from me, rather than finding out secondhand. You did this, Jonathan said. His voice had lost the boardroom polish. You're punishing me through my company. No, I said. I told your father-in-law's company about a conflict of interest, which is the legally and ethically required thing to do 8 weeks ago. What happens today was already going to happen today, before you put your hands on me last night. I have no vote in this room. I have every intention of divorcing you. Those are 2 separate facts, and I'd ask you not to confuse them for your own comfort. I left before the committee's deliberation. I didn't watch through the glass. I genuinely don't know to this day exactly how close that vote was. Thomas told me later it wasn't unanimous, that 2 of the 4 committee members were prepared to fund based purely on the numbers, and 2 weren't, uncomfortable with a founder whose personal conduct had just surfaced in the room, whether or not it was formally relevant to underwriting. It came down to a majority against, 3-1. Fenwick Route didn't get the $120 million. I understand from people who still track that world that Jonathan found a smaller round 8 months later from a fund with a much lower valuation and much less patience, and that the company is still operating, smaller than it was, run by someone whose reputation in that industry now includes a footnote nobody has to explain twice. Florence called me 11 times over the following month. I didn't answer any of them. Priya handled the divorce filing. Maryland is a no-fault state for our purposes, but I still had Dr. Kessler's chart and the urgent care photographs entered as part of the record, alongside a police report I filed the same week, not to pursue criminal charges necessarily, but because Priya advised it strengthened the protective order request. first, and because I wanted an official account to exist independent of anything the Millers might later claim. Jonathan didn't contest the divorce. I think by the time the papers reached him, he understood there wasn't a version of contesting it that ended well for him, not with a chart, a police report, and a court reporter's transcript of a binder full of receipts sitting in a folder with his name on it. The house, his parents' house, the one I'd never legally had any claim to, I let them keep, obviously. The appliances, the furniture, the television, the washing machine Florence said she'd never need, those left with the movers that first morning, all of it, itemized and signed for. I heard secondhand through someone who still talks to Jonathan's sister that Florence tells people now that I tricked her son, that I was some kind of con artist who married into their family under false pretenses. I've thought about that accusation more than I probably should. There's a version of it that isn't entirely wrong. I did withhold something true about myself for 2 years, and I understand why that stings for people on the receiving end of it, even people I don't especially like. But I think about the bucket a lot too. I think about the fact that Florence didn't dump dirty water on some woman she'd misjudged as poor and helpless. She dumped it on whoever walked through that door as Jonathan's wife on the first night, before she had any evidence at all about who I actually was. The test I ran on Jonathan for 2 years, cruel as it might have been, at least required patience. Hers took 4 hours. I don't run tests like that anymore. I've stopped believing they measure what I wanted them to measure. A man who's kind to a woman with nothing has usually just never been given the opportunity to be otherwise. And a man who turns cruel the first time cruelty is modeled for him in the room was probably always capable of it. I found that out the expensive way, in a wedding dress, on a carpet that never quite dried out before I left it behind for good.